Hi guys, today we're going to be unraveling one of the secrets of tuning. That's right, the often talked about but rarely understood dark art of the throttle pump, or as we call it here at Haltech, the Transient Throttle Enrichment function. Now, if you've been around engines or engine tuning for more than a minute, you've probably come across a vehicle or engine that runs pretty well under steady state conditions at all load and RPM areas, but when you mash the throttle quickly, the thing coughs and splutters worse than a COVID ward in winter, and then eventually it takes off again. 9 times out of 10, the reason for this is the transient throttle enrichment has not been set up correctly. Now, if that all sounds very confusing, and you've never heard a conversation around the water cooler about transient throttle enrichment, that could be because this feature goes by a few different names. Now, if you're coming from the carburetor world, you probably know this term as the accelerator pump or the accelerator enrichment valve. Or perhaps you know it as throttle pump or fuel tip in or throttle tip in. All of these terms refer to the same thing. In the Haltech software, we call it the Transient Throttle Enrichment function. And in this video, we're going to go through the physics of why this function exists in the first place and how to enable it in the software, how to set it up, and what each of the maps does. So before we get too deep into the Haltech software, let's first have a discussion about what the Transient Throttle Enrichment is and why we need it, because this will set us up for a really good understanding of how to approach the tuning process. So if we cast our minds back to the ye olde days of carburetors, you remember that in every carb, there's a fuel circuit that is activated purely by moving the throttle. The way it works is, regardless of the amount of air moving through the carburetor, when you move the throttle, you get an extra squirt of fuel. Now, if you don't believe me, take the air filter off a carburetor, with the engine not running, take a look down the hole, and stab the throttle. What you'll see is a squirt of fuel get shot into the intake manifold. This is the accelerator enrichment circuit. In a carb, it's quite an intricate balance of springs, pistons, and valves, and you can trust me when I say this, carburetor manufacturers do not put them in there for fun. And you know, if you've ever had the accelerator enrichment circuit clog up or stop working on your carb, then you know exactly what happens. The engine starts and runs just fine, so long as you're really gentle on the throttle. Everything's good. But stand on that throttle quickly and the engine has a massive lean spot. It hesitates, it often misfires and occasionally backfires through the carburetor, and then it takes off. But the question is why? Why does this happen? And how does this all relate to an EFI system? Well, that's where we have to put our physics hat on for the moment. So the key to knowing the answer to this is the lean spot. The engine's running fine until you mash the throttle and then it goes lean. But why? Well, it's actually simple physics. In a carburetor, the air and the fuel are both injected into the intake manifold at the same spot, the carby. What happens when you mash your right foot to the floor and the throttle blades slam open, you get a big gulp of air that rushes into the intake manifold. However, and here comes the physics, air is approximately 600 times lighter than fuel. So, when you get a rush of air into the intake, the air makes its way down to the valve and into the combustion chamber 600 times faster than the fuel because it's 600 times lighter. So the next time the intake valve opens, the air rushes in, the fuel hasn't caught up yet, the intake valve closes, we get compression and spark, but no bang. This happens for a couple of engine cycles until the fuel finally decides to show up to the party and we start making fire again. So the throttle pump circuit on your carburetor is designed purely to try and give that fat, lazy, heavy fuel a head start in the race to the intake valve, in the hope that some of it makes it there in time for the intake valve opening. So if you actually put an air-fuel ratio meter on a carbureted engine, you'll notice that even the most finely tuned carburetor will always have a lean spike followed by a long, rich tail on acceleration. You get the rich tail because the regular fuel delivery eventually catches up with the additional fuel in the acceleration enrichment, and the engine runs rich for a period of time. So what does this mean for our EFI systems? Well, the first thing to note is what the limitation is in the carburetor that causes this phenomenon. It's the fact that the air and the fuel are both coming into the intake at the same place. That's not actually all that common in a modern EFI system. See, typically, we find our fuel injectors are located much closer to the intake valve than the throttle body. So effectively, the fuel's now got a massive head start in the race to the intake valve. The second advantage we have with EFI is the pressure under which we're injecting the fuel, with an additional 40 psi fuel pressure pushing the fuel toward the intake valve. We're roll racing versus drag racing here. And finally, the most modern injectors do a really good job of atomizing the fuel into very fine droplets, so they can accelerate really quickly as well. So what does all this mean for us with our EFI system? Well, put simply, it means most of the time we need a lot less additional fuel to be added to the intake manifold when the throttle is snapped. Now I say most of the time here because there's always exceptions. If you're running a throttle body injection setup, you tend to find you still need to provide a lot of additional fuel in the transient throttle enrichment because you're dealing with the same limitation that a carburetor has. The fuel is still much heavier than the air, and because it's a throttle body injection setup, the fuel and the air are being injected at the same spot into the intake manifold, so we need to throw much more fuel at the race as early as possible to try and prevent the engine from misfiring. Another thing that can be different in an EFI system is using sequential fuel injection and being able to time the fuel delivery event specifically with the intake valve opening. Now, I won't go too deep into this because it's actually a topic that requires more than the available time in this video. But what I will say is the injection timing, that is to say when the fuel is injected rather than how much of fuel is being injected, often plays a really big part in the overall vehicle drivability, which includes the transient throttle setup. So the best tip I can give you here is don't put too much effort into tuning the transient throttle enrichment until after you're happy with the tune-up on all of your steady state fuel maps, which includes the injection angle map. And with all of that said, let's lift the hood on the Haltech NSP software and take a look at the transient throttle enrichment function settings and the maps available for calibration. The transient throttle enrichment setup and maps can be found under the fuel tuning node in the menu tree structure. As you can see, there are quite a few settings here to set up. Don't worry, we're going to cover them all, and in addition to this setup, there's also a bunch of maps that will need to be calibrated as well. Alright, so let's crack into it. The transient throttle load type lets the ECU know which sensor to look for to trigger the transient throttle fuel correction. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is a trick question. Don't we have to look at the throttle position for this? I mean, that's what it's called, the transient throttle correction, right? Well, normally yes, but sometimes no. There are situations where you have a throttle body that doesn't have a full sweep style throttle position sensor. So you only get two positions on the TPS, closed and open throttle, that's it. These throttle bodies are really common in early 90s fuel injection systems. In this situation, we can actually use the change of manifold pressure to trigger the throttle pump. It's not as good as using the throttle position sensor if you have a full sweep sensor, but it is better than nothing. But for this demonstration, we're going to stick to the throttle position sensor as the load type. Now we can enable a disenrichment, which is the opposite of an enrichment, so it's fuel coming out, and an overall correction. I'll come back to both of these in a moment. For now, I'll just leave them off to prevent some confusion. Now the next four setup things are what gets people most confused. We've got the load rate deadband, the load acceleration deadband, the detect duration, and the ignition decay time. Now that's some really propeller hat terminology there, so let's take a look at each setting individually. The load rate deadband is the speed at which you need to move the throttle before the throttle enrichment is activated. Now remember back to our carby car? It drove fine if you were gentle on the throttle, and it only stumbled when you stabbed that throttle quickly. Well, the same rules apply here, and this is the setting that tells us the throttle movement speed below which no correction is needed. Now, as you can see, the units of this setting are percent per second, and with a value of 25% in the load throttle deadband, I've got to move the throttle more than 25% in 1 second for the transient throttle enrichment to be activated. Now that's what it means. So as a rule of thumb, the larger the throttle area, the lower this number needs to be, which of course makes perfect sense, because all things being equal, when you put a larger throttle on an engine, to get the same amount of air into the intake, you don't need to open the throttle as far. If you're running individual throttle bodies, for example, it's not uncommon to see this load rate deadband number as low as 25%. On mild cam single throttle body engines, it can be up over 150%. That gives you a range to work with. On to the next setting. The load acceleration deadband is the speed at which you need to keep the throttle moving for the throttle enrichment to stay active. So the easiest way to think about this setting is it's the length of time the additional transient throttle fuel enrichment is being delivered. For longer injection durations, then you would use a smaller number here. Larger numbers give you a shorter duration. So in a throttle body injection setup, for example, you might use a load acceleration deadband of around 50%. And in a more modern engine, with the injectors down near the valve, you need a much shorter duration. So a load acceleration deadband of say 200 might be more appropriate. Next up, we have our detection duration. Now this is the amount of time the ECU looks at the throttle movement to determine if the throttle movement is real or noise. A smaller number is more prone to false trips, but reacts a little bit quicker. Too long, and there'll be a delay in the fuel delivery. Typically, I would normally set this value to between 5 and 10 milliseconds. Then we have this Enable Async button. Now, if I turn this setting on, I get a couple of more settings and another map to tune. But what does this async injection mean? Well, put simply, this setting tells the ECU to deliver some fuel to all of the injectors immediately when the throttle pump is triggered. Think of it a lot like that carburetor circuit. You move the throttle, you get more fuel. Now, that all makes sense, but let's remember for a moment, unlike a carb, most modern EFI injection systems spray fuel directly at the valve at a very specific time, in a sequential manner. So there are two possible ways the ECU could deliver the extra fuel required for the transient throttle enrichment. We could simply extend the next programmed injector pulse and time the fuel delivery with the valve opening. We would call this synchronous injection because it's synchronized with the next injection event. Or we could just pulse the injectors as soon as we see the throttle move. That's called asynchronous injection because it's not synchronized with the next injection event. Now, obviously, if you're not running sequential injection, your best results will come from using asynchronous injection. But if you're running sequential injection, you can normally get better results from synchronous injection, so just extending the next pulse. That's not always the case, however. Engines with big camshafts and a lot of valve overlap often require a good amount of both synchronous and asynchronous injection to be snappy. It is what it is. Okay, so let's assume for a moment that we have our engine set up and running and tuned really well in steady state. And now we actually want to tune the transient throttle enrichment maps. So we snap the throttle, it moves faster than the load rate deadband value, so the ECU decides, yes, I need to inject some additional fuel into the engine. There's two questions that the ECU asks itself. One, how much fuel do I need to deliver? And two, when and how do I need to deliver it? And all of that depends on a combination of what you've programmed into the injection rate map and the injection amount maps for both the synchronous and asynchronous enrichment. Let's take a look first at the enrichment rate map. Now the first thing I'll note is that both the synchronous and the asynchronous enrichment amount maps refer back to this one enrichment rate map. So in simple terms, if we had 50% in the entire enrichment rate map and 100% over in the entire synchronous enrichment amount map, when the transient throttle enrichment is triggered, the ECU would extend the next injection pulse by 50%. Okay, how did I work that out? Well, my rate map said to add 50% more fuel to the next injection event. And at the particular RPM I'm at in the synchronous enrichment amount map, I've said, well, apply 100% of that correction. So the ECU extends the next injection pulse by 100% of 50%, which is 50% more fuel. Now, if I had all the same settings, but rather than having the synchronous enrichment amount set to 100%, I had it set to 0, and the asynchronous map was set to 100, then the ECU would still attempt to inject the same amount of additional fuel, which is 50% more, but rather than just extending the next programmed injector pulse, the ECU would immediately pulse all the injected for the calculated injection time. If I had 100% in both maps, which is possible, the ECU would do both. It would extend the next programmed injection pulse, as well as immediately pulse all of the injectors. So they were the easy to understand numbers. Let's look back at the base map setup and see what the tables actually look like. So opening up the enrichment rate map, we have two axes. The y-axis has the throttle start position, and the x-axis has the transient throttle load derivative, which in layman's terms is just how fast you're moving the throttle. So the reason this is a 3D map is because you could be sitting at the McDonald's parking lot stabbing the throttles from idle to impress the local law enforcement, or you could be barreling down the straight, coming into turn 3 of a local racetrack at 25% throttle and 4,000 RPM and just leaning on the throttle on the way out of the corner. Both conditions will require an amount of transient throttle fuel enrichment, but totally different start positions and a totally different amount of additional fuel, which is why this map exists as a map. The y-axis is the start throttle position. The x-axis is how fast you're moving the throttle. So you can see in the base map, the lower the throttle angle to start with, and the faster you stab the throttle, the more additional fuel you need. Now we've also got an ignition correction map that's often used in conjunction with the transient fuel enrichment map. And I know this is an ignition map, not a fuel map, but the reason some tuners like to use this map is that the big gulp of air that rushes into the engine can cause the engine to knock for just a moment when the throttle is stabbed quickly and under high stress conditions. Now, we normally only see this on high compression knock limited engines, but the phenomenon is real, which is why this map exists. And finally, we've got a coolant temp correction map. Now basically, when the engine's cold, much of the fuel delivered to the intake manifold pulls on the intake manifold walls. So if the engine's cold, we need a bunch more fuel in the transient throttle enrichment map. The further the injector is away from the intake valve, the more coolant temp correction will be required. All right, so now we're armed with a little bit of background information. We can begin to tune this map up on an engine. And this is where I actually get a lot of questions. How do I tune the throttle pumps? And what am I aiming for? And with all things tuning, the answer to that one is, it depends. So on a race car, my aim is to have the engine be snappy and not have flat spots when the throttle is pressed. On a street car, where maybe emissions are going to be required, I'll often slow down the throttle opening so that the transient throttle enrichment is actually not required at all, because that extra fuel equals excess hydrocarbons, which may mean failing the emissions test. The other thing I would say is before I even touch the transient throttle enrichment, I'd make sure that I'm happy with all of the other fuel mapping parameters and that the engine is running really, really well, which includes tuning the end of injection angle for either maximum torque or the richest air-fuel ratio. Again, I'm not going to talk about it too much, but trust me, that does make a difference. Now, only then would I look at mapping the transient throttle. Now from here, my process would be, if the injectors are down near the valve, I'd turn off the asynchronous injection completely, and I'd rely solely on the synchronous injection. Then I'd go into the enrichment rate map and I'd stab the throttle as quickly as I can, a couple of times, and I'd turn the trace mode on while I'm doing this. Now this is going to show me what cells in the map are possible for me to get to, so at least I know what I'm possibly working with. And from here, it's really a process of make an adjustment and feel how the engine responds. Now, you can also use the air-fuel ratio as a reasonable guide to how you're doing. Now, you don't want to see the air-fuel ratio sink to 10:1 and then stay there for 5 seconds every time you stab the throttle. But don't worry too much if there's a little peak and a trough. If the engine sounds good, responds well, and drives well, that's what you're looking for. Go with what the engine's telling you. I know this is a complex topic and there's a lot of moving parts, So understanding the fundamentals of why we need this transient throttle fuel enrichment does help in the setup and tuning of the engine. The underlying physics of fuel being heavier than air, and therefore the air being able to accelerate faster than the fuel, means that the further the injector is away from the intake valve, the more additional fuel will be required in the transient throttle enrichment maps. Where the fuel injection is not sequential, and therefore it's not timed to any intake valve opening, asynchronous injection works best, where as soon as the throttle moves, the ECU injects the extra fuel into the manifold from all the injectors. The faster the throttle's moved, the bigger the gulp of air, and therefore the more transient throttle enrichment is required. And finally, the higher the engine RPM is to start with, the less additional fuel is required. So hopefully this video has given you a little bit more understanding and insight into how to approach your transient throttle enrichment maps. Now, if you're paying attention, then tell us in 10 words or less in the comments below the difference between synchronous and asynchronous injection types, and the first 3 correct answers will get a free pair of these cool Haltech workshop gloves. If you liked the video, don't forget to ring the bell icon for notifications on all of our latest YouTube videos. If you haven't already subscribed to our monthly newsletter, go ahead and do that now to find out about all the latest product offerings, and of course, give us a follow on all the social media channels. Well, that's all I've got time for today. I'm Matt from Haltech, and I'll see you next time.